Okay, here is the fourth installment of the video lecture series on learning, and we're going to finish up the stuff with classical conditioning on part 4 here. Now that we have an understanding of the components of classical conditioning, and I did my best to try to give you some down-to-earth examples to start, I'm going to give you some more as well. Now, understanding how classical conditioning works, we can now use this knowledge of this type of learning to help people. A lot of times people will learn negative things. They'll develop phobias of like needles or thunder or whatever through classical conditioning. So if we understand that things can be learned through classical conditioning, then they must also be able to be unlearned, right? Through classical conditioning. So we can use our knowledge of how this works to help people overcome problems. So let me start there. Now, I'm going to use my daughter as an example. When my daughter was very young, she was, like a lot of young children, very afraid of thunderstorms. Anytime she would hear thunder, she would scream. It would just be a very instinctive, natural stimulus response. I'm going to cover up the bottoms here just for a second. So, and I'm going to abbreviate. US stands for unconditioned stimulus. UR stands for unconditioned response, just to kind of make things easier here. So you can see, the unconditioned or unlearned stimulus is thunder. It's out there, it exists, it's natural. Her unlearned or instinctive response would be to scream. This is not an adaptive behavior. We don't want her to do this. So I'm thinking, if I can get her to associate the unconditioned stimulus with something positive, then I might be able to change her response. And that's how classical conditioning works. If you remember, the unconditioned stimulus has to be paired with the conditioned stimulus. So I thought, I knew that my daughter really liked these Brock's pumpkin treats. I think my thumb might be covering them up there. If you've ever had candy corn, it's kind of like the same thing, except they're shaped like pumpkins. And they are really, really, really good, by the way. So what I did was I told her, I said, Madison, if you can stay calm during this thunderstorm, then you'll get a pumpkin treat. And she's like, okay, Daddy, I can do that. So she did. She started to associate the thunder with the candy, which produced a new response. The conditioned response would be for her to be able to stay calm. So using classical conditioning, I've gotten her to be able to pair the thunderstorm with the candy. Now instead of screaming, she's able to stay calm. That's called counter conditioning. That's important to understand. This happens when you pair the unconditioned stimulus with something good. Another example of this, when I was little, I used to hate getting shots. A lot of kids don't like needles. For me, the unconditioned stimulus would be the needle, and the unconditioned response was for me to run. I would literally run out of the doctor's office into the busy street with traffic when I was a kid. Not a good thing. So my doctor, Dr. Smith, who was in Alum Creek at the time, decided that he would offer me something. He would say to me, Brandon, if you can sit still and take this shot, I will give you a sucker. It wasn't really a pumpkin treat, but pretty much the same thing. A pumpkin, or a sucker, rather. So he said, not only that, I'll give you 2 suckers if you can sit here and take your shot. So I started to learn. I'm starting now to associate the needle, the unconditioned stimulus, with the suckers, the conditioned stimulus. Now instead of running out into the street, my new learned or conditioned response would be to stay calm and to stay seated while he gave me the shot. So without realizing it, he used counter conditioning to change my behavior for the better. Now, this is another type of classical conditioning. It's called aversion conditioning. Sometimes we purposely pair the unconditioned stimulus with something bad. And you might think, well, why would you do that? Well, here's the problem. Sometimes people have very natural, unconditioned responses to things that are bad. Alcohol is a great example. Alcohol is an unlearned, unconditioned stimulus. Right there it is at the top. A lot of people can drink alcohol in moderation and be okay. A lot of people cannot handle alcohol, and it creates problems. So that's the first part of this paradigm, is that we have, we'll cover some of that up, the unconditioned stimulus, alcohol, which produces the unlearned response or unconditioned response of pleasure. So now, here's the problem. I'm going to use a colleague of mine. I'm going to call him, let's say his name was Dave, although it wasn't. Dave was a fellow psychologist, and Dave had a problem with alcohol. He would, he would skip work. I remember one time we had to go to a conference. It was a part of our job. We had to go to Huntington and sit through a 6-hour conference. and he decided he was going to cross the street and drink in the bar for 6 hours instead of going to the conference with the rest of us. We tried to talk him out of it, no good. After the conference, he comes out stumbling drunk, falling down. His eyes are black. Looks like he's been into a fight. And he says, "Brandon, I need to borrow $500. And this was like 15 years ago. And I say to Dave, "Why? Well, how could you need $500? You were over there for like 5 or 6 hours." He had consumed, and I'm not lying about this, 30 Black and Tans. Those are beers, by the way. And not only that, he had purchased alcohol for every woman who had walked into the bar. Wasn't able to pay his tab. He got beat up. The bouncers threw him out. And now we're starting to realize it's time for an intervention for Dave. Dave is not doing very well. So we talk him into going to therapy. There's this drug called antabuse. If you agree to put it in your body, when it mixes with alcohol, it makes you violently ill, like projectile vomit sick. And he knows he's got a problem, so he agrees, Dave agrees to go to therapy and agrees to put this in his system, which he does. He puts the drug in his body. Now, so far we have unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, which is the antabuse. Now, again, remember, for classical conditioning to work, and aversion conditioning is a type of this, the unconditioned stimulus, which is the alcohol, must be associated with the conditioned stimulus, which is the antabuse. In other words, the drug that causes you to be sick when you drink alcohol. Okay, keep that in mind. So we're out at a restaurant, and Dave decides he's going to go to a bar. I'm like, "Dave, you shouldn't do that. That's not a good place for you to be." Dave insists, so being a good friend, I went with him just to kind of observe. And sure enough, he goes up to the bar. He's got a beer in his hand. I'm like, "Dave, you shouldn't do this. You have this antabuse in your system. You know what's going to happen. This is bad news." He's like, "I got it. I can handle it." I'm like, "Okay." And so I go stand against the wall, and I'm watching. One beer turns into 6, turns into 7, turns into 8. I'm thinking, "Ooh, this can't be good." So Dave, doing what Dave does, starts hitting on a girl at the bar, talking to her, and he's working his magic. Things seem to be working pretty well for him until, in the middle of a sentence, he becomes so violently ill, that's the picture of the Family Guy vomiting down here, that he projectile vomits in the face of this girl. I mean, in the middle of a sentence. And of course, she's standing there with her arms out like, "Are you kidding me?" And then he tries to apologize, and in the middle of saying, "I'm sorry," before he could get the word sorry out of his mouth, he vomits in her face again, projectile. Now, you can imagine it didn't go well for him with this girl after that. So now it worked, though. Classical conditioning here, aversion conditioning actually worked for him. Because Dave, for the longest time, anytime we were out and he thought about drinking alcohol, instead of thinking about the pleasure it would bring, he associated it with the antabuse and remembered how sick he got and how embarrassed he was when that happened, that it just actually served as an aversion. He couldn't drink because he just thought about how sick he was. And he was really, really sick. So that worked for him for a while. So that's aversion conditioning. So you've purposely paired the unconditioned stimulus alcohol with something bad, which would be antabuse. I've heard of people putting like Tabasco sauce or hot sauce on their cigarettes to keep them from smoking. That would be the same kind of premise. So this stuff can work. So there's an image of Dave. That's kind of what he looked like too, drinking beer. So, all right. Let's go ahead and call. That finishes up the stuff with classical conditioning. The other types of learning will go much more quickly, but I just wanted to kind of take some time and labor over those a little bit. We'll go ahead and call, again, rewind these, watch them again if you need to, and we'll call that the end of this part. Thanks.